Now, we all know that these horrible scenes depict 6 million of the Jews who were gassed under the National Socialist regime of Adolf Hitler in homicidal gas chambers. Here we are on a private tour of a typical Nazi gas chamber. Here we have the ramp going down into the gas chamber, the stains of Zyklon B on the ceiling, the reinforced walls to stop the victims from escaping, and crashing through the windows and running away. And here we are now down inside the very gas chamber itself with the fake shower heads all around the walls, the fake shower heads where no water ever sprayed out. Only Zyklon B gas came out. Here are the drainage runnels in the floor so that the SS men could hose down the place afterwards, after the gas chamber had done its deadly deed. Here in the ceiling are scratch marks in the very beams in the ceiling where the piles of victims have tried to claw their way out through the ceiling to escape this horrible death. Here are the fake shower heads where the Zyklon B gas was sprayed out from these massive installations, these pipes in the next room with the valves operated by the SS men. And here too is the changing room next door to the gas chamber where the victims were lured and tricked into believing that they were going to take a shower where in fact they were going to their deaths. Here's a tiny remnant of one of the victims and more drainage runnels for hosing down the room after the deadly deed. Benches where the people had their hair shaved by Jewish barbers, and here's the booth where the SS man sat and supervised. He was even such a fanatical Nazi he had to paint a swastika on his desk while he supervised his innocent Jewish victims going to their deaths. Here are the massive extractor fans, more pipes and valves to channel the Zyklon B into the deadly gas chamber. Here are the hoses to hose down the place after the deadly deed, to hose down the blood, the menstrual fluid and the feces of the dying victims. Of course, the whole place is disguised as a very innocuous temple in the Greek style. Or is it? It could almost pass for an athletic club, or perhaps even a swimming pool. Well, is it a gas chamber, or is it a swimming pool? In fact, I think we've just demonstrated to you how easy it is to misrepresent perfectly ordinary facilities, in this case a municipal swimming pool in California, and a perfectly ordinary shower bath, and a perfectly ordinary ramp leading up to the swimming pool. We've been able to misrepresent those perfectly innocuous facilities as a homicidal gas chamber. And this just shows how easy it is to do this, how you can look at perfectly ordinary fixtures and make them out to be something horrendously horrible and homicidal. So in this little film you're about to see, we're going to demonstrate to you how the exterminationist historians have done this with the facilities in continental Europe.
No German can say he did not know about them. This was not used as a bathhouse, but as a death chamber. Batches of prisoners were marched in here to die. When the chamber was full, the doors were shut and sealed. A man at the controls let in the poison gas, and another batch of helpless victims screamed their lives out beyond the grill.
Dachau, factory of horrors. Dachau, near München, one of the oldest of the Nazi prison camps. Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower for which towels and soap were provided. This is the Brausbad, the shower bath. Inside the shower bath, the gas vent. On the ceiling, the dummy shower heads. In the engineer's room, the intake and outlet pipe. Push buttons to control inflow and outtake of gas. A hand valve to regulate pressure. Cyanide powder was used to generate the lethal smoke.
Hello, I'm David McCaldon. I'll be your host throughout this little program, Holocaust Revisionism for Beginners. Those two excerpts from documentary film that you've just seen were both made shortly after the close of World War II. The first film was actually made by the British-American producer Alfred Hitchcock, and apparently the footage was compiled by Hitchcock and a script was written, and then the film was somehow lost in some archives before it was discovered in about 1986-87 when it was broadcast on public television in the United States for the first time as part of a 60 Minutes special program. The narration was read by the British actor Trevor Howard, who died in December 1987, shortly after that program was broadcast. The second documentary you saw was entitled Nazi Concentration Camps, and that footage, which was mostly taken by American photographers but also by British photographers at Belsen, that film was shown at the International Nuremberg Tribunal, the so-called war crimes trial of the Nazi leadership, which was held in Nuremberg from late 1945 through 1946. And the film Nazi Concentration Camps was also shown at the trial in Toronto, Canada, of Ernst Zundel in January and February of 1985, when Ernst Zundel was put on trial for supposedly publishing false news, in that he published a pamphlet. He didn't write the pamphlet, he just published a Canadian edition of a booklet called Did 6 Million Really Die? The authorities in Canada took a very dim view of that booklet being published because it contained very explicit revisionist views. He was put on trial and sentenced to 15 months in jail, plus automatic deportation afterwards. However, because of a successful appeal, Ernst Zundel was awarded a new trial, a retrial, on the same charge. Now, those two films were both made, like I say, shortly after the end of World War II. The footage was taken shortly after the liberation of the camps, and it was compiled into these two films shortly thereafter, in other words, in 1945-46. Now, at that time, it was alleged that all of the camps throughout Germany and German-occupied Europe were for extermination purposes, and you saw, in particular, with the excerpts that we gave you, you saw that the Dachau concentration camp, just outside of Munich, was alleged to have a fully functioning gas chamber where people were gassed to death as part of some Nazi extermination program. However, in the intervening years, since 1945 through to the present day, somewhere along the way that claim has been dropped, and nowadays it is not claimed by Holocaust experts or even by the Dachau Museum that the gas chamber at Dachau functioned as an extermination chamber. For example, I have here a photocopy of the official guide to the Dachau Museum, and they state here quite explicitly, this is the English version, but there's also versions in other languages. Here they state quite clearly that the gas chamber at Dachau was never used, and that is a fairly widely held view amongst Orthodox Holocaust historians. Now, just to give you some idea of what those rooms were supposed to be and what they really were, here's a copy of Dr. Arthur Butz's book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, and in here we have some photographs from the U.S. Army. For example, here is a picture of one of those little gassing closets where you saw the clothes outside, and it says quite clearly, this is a 1945 photograph, it says quite clearly, gassing time from 7:30 to 10 a.m. in the morning, danger, mortal danger, gas, do not open, and there's a skull and crossbones there. Now obviously if this gassing closet was for human beings, they certainly wouldn't advertise the fact on the front door. So this gassing closet was what the Germans actually claimed it was. It was actually a room for fumigating clothes and for delousing clothes, because here's a view from the inside of that little gassing closet, and you can see the hooks up here in the ceiling where they would hang clothes from. Then the doors would be closed and sealed, and the fumigation process would take place, probably with the use of Zyklon B pellets, because Zyklon B is a pesticide which would get rid of all the bugs and lice in the people's clothing, the people who were being brought into the camp from all kinds of countryside places. Now, of course, when those U.S. congressmen visited the camp on their little tour, and when they were told that those shower heads were actually for spraying out gas, the bug problem still had not been totally cured, because here's one of the congressmen. This is Senator Query getting sprayed with some kind of insecticide, whether it's Zyklon B or whether it's DDT, we're not quite sure. But this soldier is squirting DDT out of a thing that looks like a flit can, if you remember those from about 20 years ago. He's squirting this stuff down the back of the senator's jacket. And here are the senators and congressmen inside the alleged giant gas chamber, disguised as a shower room, supposedly. And there's a list of all the names of all the politicians at the bottom of the photograph here. And they're being told by the soldier who's guiding them, they're being told that these holes in the ceiling were for squirting out gas and not for squirting out water. Now, of course, this, by the way, is the outside of the large shower room, which was supposedly a gas chamber. Now, of course, all of this raises a number of interesting questions, because if in 1945-46 it could be widely held in photographs and in movies and at international tribunals, if it could be maintained and supposedly proved with the empirical evidence that those rooms, the little closets and the large shower room, if it could be proved to the satisfaction of an international tribunal that those places were used for extermination of people, then how come over the intervening 40 years that claim has now been dropped? Because nowadays, not only is it not maintained that Dachau was an extermination camp, but now the official viewpoint from the official historians is that none of the camps in Germany proper were extermination camps. And you'll see on this map here, this is a map of German-occupied Europe with all the camps highlighted with these little skull and crossbones symbols. The ones with black on white are supposed to be concentration camps only, and you'll see that Dachau is down here in the south of Germany as a concentration camp. According to the official historians, the camps which were for death, which were extermination camps, were all of those out here in the east, in German-occupied Poland: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Belzec, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, and Stutthof. So it seems that during the period between 1945 and the early 1960s, it looks like the exterminationists, the official historians, have themselves revised their own theory. Originally they said all the camps had gas chambers and all the camps were for extermination, and now they've moved their own Holocaust further east to central Poland. And as we look further into this subject, we'll find that not only is the Holocaust moving further east into central Poland, currently it's moving further east again, out into eastern Poland, and in a few minutes we'll take a look at some of the evidence for that. Now the question I'm sure you're asking is, if the Germans did not have a policy of exterminating people in homicidal gas chambers, then how else can one explain these horrible, horrible scenes of thousands upon thousands of dead bodies lying all over the place at various camps, such as this scene from Belsen in early 1945. After the British liberated this particular camp, they found thousands of these dead bodies lying all around the camp, and so they immediately set about giving these bodies a sanitary burial. They told the German workers, the German staff, to dig these mass graves and to collect all the bodies from all around the camp and bury them in these burial pits. Now, a couple of aspects about these bodies strike us immediately. First of all, many of these bodies are stark naked, indicating that their clothing was stolen from them by fellow inmates or by whomever. And that in itself shows that there must have been substantial chaos and a breakdown in law and order in the camps in the closing stages of the war. Secondly, most, if not all, of these bodies are of persons in a very emaciated condition. And that would indicate to us either one of two things. Either these people starved to death through a lack of food, or else they were victims of an epidemic disease. All of these people look like AIDS victims in modern terms. So this again indicates that there was a breakdown in the distribution of food and medicine to the camps in the closing stages of the war. Ironically, we have to turn to Alfred Hitchcock, the director, and his narrator, Trevor Howard, for an explanation of how this came about.
The answer is simply the dread word, typhus. A mobile bacteriological unit and all medical aid possible, together with 90 medical students from London hospitals, were rushed to the spot to deal with it. Lack of soap and water brought lice to the inmates, and lice carry typhus. To get rid of typhus, one must first get rid of lice. So contaminated patients were removed from their huts and put through a laundry process. DDT was dusted over them, and they were washed clean, wrapped in blankets, and removed in clean ambulances by teams working in relays in a miracle of relief work.
But of course, besides there being many sick inmates in some of the camps, there were also many healthy inmates, as these scenes, which are also from Belsen, would indicate. These people, mostly women and children in these particular scenes, look perfectly healthy and quite cheerful. So therefore it would be apparent that the Germans did not have an ongoing universal extermination policy, because if they did have a genocidal policy, then these people in these scenes would not be as healthy and would not even be as alive as they are. In fact, a British medic who went into Belsen camp shortly after the liberation, Dr. Russell Barton, who now teaches at a mental hospital in Rochester, New York, he went into Belsen camp and had the expectation that the Germans had been operating an extermination policy, but much to his surprise he found that the horrible scenes and the dead bodies were due not to a deliberate policy of extermination, but to an outbreak of typhus, and he was one of the 90 medics referred to in the Hitchcock film a few moments ago. This particular scene is from Dachau camp, where we came in. This is where we saw the supposed gas chamber, and again, these inmates, who are mostly male in this particular case, they all seem perfectly healthy, and in a few cases seem even quite chubby. So again, it's obvious that the Germans did not have an extermination policy, otherwise there wouldn't be so many
healthy inmates walking around, nor would there be these acres upon acres of living accommodation in what was supposed to be a death factory. Now, in the scenes from the camps which we just saw, I'm sure you will have observed that there were tremendous differences in the level of suffering, both within each camp and also between and among the various camps. Obviously, Belsen was far and away the worst camp because it had the most horrible and most widespread outbreak of typhus. But Buchenwald was also pretty bad because they had massive numbers of people being shipped in from the eastern camps in Poland, such as Auschwitz, which were threatened by a Soviet liberation and all that entailed. Belsen was the worst, Buchenwald was second worst, and Dachau was probably third worst. But the rest of the camps in Germany proper weren't really as bad as Belsen, that's for sure. Now, you also have noticed that some of the inmates were very, very sick, and some of the inmates were quite healthy. Most of the staff seemed fairly healthy, at least the ones that we saw in the pictures. But of course, all of Germany wasn't free of starvation and free of disease. I have here a book entitled Nemesis at Potsdam. There's some very, very interesting pictures in this book, and in the 45 years or so since World War II, according to my research, this is about the only book that has been published. This one was published in 1979. This is about the only one that I've come across which actually describes the suffering of the German people in 1945, 1946. And I won't read you the text right now because it is quite a thick academic work, but I will show you some of the pictures in this book. It's by Dr. Alfred Desaias, who is an American professor. I believe he works in Switzerland at the present time. The picture on the cover depicts some of the German refugees who were expelled from the former German territories in East Prussia and in Silesia, territories which are now part of Poland. And the people were expelled from those territories at the end of the war in the most brutal fashion. And in some cases, if the Soviet army, the Red Army, caught up with them, they massacred the civilians as they were trekking their way from East Prussia to the supposed safety of Western Germany. The village of Nemmersdorf in East Prussia received the attentions of the Red Army, and they massacred over 70 civilians at Nemmersdorf. And of course, some of these pictures are so horrific. For example, look at this picture down here of two little children, about 4 or 5 years old, who have been shot to death by Soviet troops. This picture is so horrific that it has been recycled by cynical exterminationists, and this picture and pictures like it appear in Holocaust picture books, where they claim that these are actually dead Jewish babies that have been killed by the wicked Germans. On the next page are some of these treks I was telling you about, when thousands upon thousands of German civilians were expelled from the eastern territories and had to load all their possessions into these carts and had to trek their way across hostile Polish territory to try to reach the safety of Western Germany. And along the way they were attacked both by the Red Army and by Soviet aircraft, and oftentimes the treks were plundered by marauding bands of Polish partisans. And of course 3 German ships that tried to sail across the Baltic Sea to safety were sunk by Soviet torpedoes in the closing stages of the war. And in fact, the world's worst naval disaster concerned this ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was torpedoed by a Soviet ship, or by a Soviet submarine, I mean, on the night of January 30th, 1945. And that disaster, when there was about 6,000 people, went down. We're not quite sure because the ship was so overcrowded. They didn't keep a proper manifest of the people on board. But with 6,000 people or so on board, that was and is the world's worst naval disaster. That over here we see some of the German civilians being expelled from Czechoslovakia, and look at how many people they have crammed into one little goods car on this train, and down here also. These are people being expelled from the Sudetenland, which was German territory for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in 1945, the Czechoslovakians decided that it was time they seized that particular part of the world, and so they seized the Sudeten Germans' homes and land and expelled the civilians in this most cruel and most brutal way. Now, of course, when the refugees got into Western Germany, life wasn't much better. Here you can see some of the expellees from the Sudetenland living in these Quonset huts, and you can see that the conditions here are not much different from the conditions at Dachau, with bunks upon bunks and very primitive heating conditions and very primitive cooking and sanitary conditions. And if you think starvation was unique to the inmates of the camps, take a look at this picture of 3 German children in a Danzig orphanage, and you can see that these little kids are as skinny as can be. They're almost all skin and bone, and of course a lot of them didn't make it. Down here is a cemetery for expellees who died of starvation along the way or shortly after they got to Western Germany, and oftentimes they were so bedraggled that they didn't even have an identification on them. This grave here says Unbekannte Frau, an unknown woman, and there's a whole graveyard full of these sites. A lot of the expellees were suffering from infestation with vermin, lice and bugs and all the rest of it. This little boy is getting squirted with the same kind of DDT spray that we saw earlier on. Here's some more skinny little girls, again in a very primitive Quonset hut type of accommodation. These kids are so hungry they're scraping the bottom of the pot. And here this little boy in Hamburg is so hungry that he's going through the trash cans to see if he can find something worth eating. And down below here in the bottom left, this American GI has to sort out the garbage into edible garbage, non-edible garbage, and trash only, so that the little orphans and waifs in the street will not be tempted into eating garbage which is non-digestible. Now, just as there were stark contrasts between the German civilians, some of them were well-fed and some of them were starving, likewise there are equally graphic contrasts between the concentration camps. Earlier on we saw Belsen concentration camp with thousands of starving and diseased people. But these scenes come from Theresienstadt, which was also a concentration camp, which is located in what is modern-day Czechoslovakia. Now you can see from these scenes from a German film, the film's called The Führer Gives the Jews a Town. You can see from these scenes that many of the inmates of the concentration camps didn't suffer the privations and starvation that the people at Belsen did at the end of the war. These inmates of Theresienstadt seem very happy. You can see that they're enjoying a mutual shower, and there is real hot water coming out. It's not gas. They have all kinds of recreational facilities. They have a well-stocked library here, you can see. They also were allowed to go to concerts by the camp orchestra. They could plant their own little vegetable garden, also within the perimeter of the camp. Of course, nowadays, no one maintains that any of the camps in Germany proper or in the West had gas chambers. In the 1960s, the focus was moved from the camps in Germany to the camps in central Poland, in particular Auschwitz, or Auschwitzum as it's known in Polish. This camp was liberated by the Soviet army in early 1945. But again, you see there's a similar problem to Dachau. Here we see acres upon acres of living accommodations, which tends to contradict the allegation of this being a mill of death. In fact, Auschwitz was a vast industrial complex, and here you can see the Buna rubber works
at Auschwitz-Monowitz, and it was in these factories that the internees from the camp went to work each day in the German war effort. These are some of the people who were liberated from Auschwitz by the Soviet army, and you can see that most of them seem pretty well fed and well clothed. Now, in an effort to resolve this seeming contradiction, this puzzle, I myself went to Auschwitz in Poland during the summer of 1987 together with a film crew, and we put together this film investigation entitled The Holocaust Revisited. And this structure we're looking at now is the so-called gas chamber of Auschwitz I, the Auschwitz main camp. And in just a moment we're going to take a look inside the actual gas chamber to see if the evidence supports the legend.
According to the legend, 600 to 700 people were put into the gas chamber all at once. And you'll see on the inside that they must have been pretty tightly packed, because we watched tour groups of 35 and 40 people go in here, and they were feeling pretty pinched. But the first thing is, let's look at the front door. You'll see here, it's a pretty heavy door, but it's not exactly the hydraulic sliding hermetically sealed door that is alleged in the legend. Here is supposedly a peephole where the administrators of the gas chamber could peep in to make sure the people had all been sufficiently gassed. However, the problem is there's no glass in this peephole right now, by the way. So whether there was originally or not, we don't know, but I guess if there was no glass originally, the gas would all flow out through the peephole and evaporate. But in any case, looking through the peephole into the supposed gas chamber shows not the gas chamber itself, but an interior wall. This wall is just solid brick and masonry, so you can't actually see in to the gas chamber itself to see what's going on. There is an interior door here in this side door. It's a much flimsier door. This one's pretty solid. This one is just an ordinary Polish farmhouse door, and this one has no peephole. And the interesting thing is that both of these doors open inwards. So if all those bodies were all piled up inside the gas chamber here, surely it would be impossible to open the door with all the bodies piled up on top or piled up behind the door. It would just be impossible to open the door to get the bodies out. Now, if we just step inside here, I'll show you some interesting features of this supposed gas chamber. Now, first of all, you'll see these four light fixtures along the ceiling. In Mel Mermelstein's book by Bread Alone, he points to these light fixtures and says, look at the shower heads in the ceiling where the gas came out. Well, I look at these light fixtures and all I can see is light fixtures. I look for shower heads or what would have been shower heads, and I can see nothing of that kind. What I can find is as follows. Here is one hole in the ceiling, and you can see Andy at the top is opening it for us and putting down a measuring tape to see exactly how wide or how broad it is. It appears to me that these four apertures have been punched into the ceiling by poles after the war. There's one right here, and there's another one back here. There's another one right here. That's three. And there'll be another one right here. So all these four holes are all pretty much identical, although these two at the back here seem to be deteriorating somewhat around the sides. And so they're going to be trying to do some little repairs to the edges of the inside of the ceiling there. Now there is one other aperture which and that's over this wall. It's hard to see, but it looks like there used to be a stove here, a little like a stove from a railroad station or from a Polish kitchen. Anyway, Andy is putting down the tape later to show the hollow chimney here. If you look up, you can see the hollow chimney and some of the reinforcements to keep it from deteriorating. And when we go up on top of the roof, we'll show you what those things look like from the outside.
Now let's look at the floor plan of this particular room. It seems to me that there used to have been some kind of partitions. Here's one partition coming out to here, and here's another partition coming out in the opposite direction to here. So obviously there was some kind of cubicles in this room. Here's a manhole here, which appears to be access down to the sewers. As far as the gas and yeast didn't try to escape down to the sewers. And over here, very far in, there are some interesting little structures. Here's what used to be a T-shaped wall. There's a wall here going up, and there's a sewer there, there's a sewer there. So that seems to have been two toilets back to back. And over here is another sewer against the wall. And this obviously was a washhand basin where people could go to the toilet and then wash their hands afterwards, like good Germans always would. There's another drain over there on the floor, and to the side here is an open doorway. There's no door in it, and the edges are very jagged. We'll go through there in just a second. But right now, I'd just like to draw together all of these pieces of evidence and to reflect on the fact that the German plans for this room do not say gas chamber, they don't say gas camera. The German plans actually say Leichenkeller, which means mortuary. And that's exactly what this room was. It was a mortuary for doing autopsies and pathologies on dead people who came across the building next door, which was the SS hospital. They brought the bodies in through that door. They prepared them for cremation in this room. And over here were the solutions where the staff could clean up after handling the corpses.
Now, if you're new to revisionism, you probably suspect, or you've probably been told, that only people who were neo-Nazis or anti-Semites would want to whitewash the Nazi war crimes in such a fashion. Now, it may be true that some revisionists do have another agenda, that they are sympathetic to National Socialism, but there again, there are many other revisionists, such as myself, who are totally opposed to National Socialism and who maintain a more objective approach to politics. We showed you the horrible scenes at Belsen due to the German inability to deliver food and drugs through to that camp, but we also showed you some of the Soviet atrocities, some of the Allied atrocities, such as the massacre of civilians at Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, and that was just one example. In fact, the only reason we have footage of that atrocity is because the Germans very briefly managed to push back the Soviets out of that part of East Prussia. They took back those little villages, and then they were so appalled at what they found that they sent in film crews and forensic experts to document those Soviet atrocities. Likewise, although it was very horrible to round people up and put them in camps in Germany and throughout German-occupied Europe, likewise it was also a tremendous violation of civil rights and human rights for the United States government to round up civilians who happened to be of Japanese descent and put them in concentration camps in the western states of the USA. If it was wrong for the Germans to have caused such suffering and privation, either by commission or by omission in the camps, then surely it was also wrong for the Allies to have launched a war of genocide from the sky when they sent firebombs down into German cities such as Hamburg and Dresden and burned alive hundreds of thousands of German civilians, many of whom had fled from the advancing Red Army and thought they would find refuge in places like Dresden, which was like Paris. It was such a historic, such an architecturally precious city. Nobody thought for 1 minute that this devastation would be rained down from the sky onto a historic city with such beautiful architecture, which was packed with hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing from the Soviet hordes. So we revisionists are not partisan in World War II or any war. We're just the guys who want to get at the truth, and that's why we send these forensic investigation teams far out into the boondocks of Poland in order to check these allegations of mass genocide and mass gassings and so on. It's rather significant, in fact, that the exterminationists never bother to go to these sites except on ceremonial visits. Sometimes when they go and lay a wreath at Auschwitz or whatever, they never actually go to the sites of Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and the more obscure places where the Holocaust has now been relocated. They never go to those sites to do any forensic examination or any scientific investigations to see if the evidence supports their theories. In fact, the exterminationist studies are basically incestuous. It's just a case of one historian quoting another historian, quoting another historian, quoting another historian, and the whole thing is like a house of cards. Once you take away the gas chamber part of the legend, then the whole thing comes tumbling down. Now, if you'd like to get involved in revisionist work yourself, there's many, many ways that you can help the revisionist movement. This is a very, very important movement. It's a movement of the modern age because, in my opinion, and you can take it or leave it, but my opinion is that unless the Holocaust is debunked, I think that the world is heading for a World War III, which may well be the very last world war that this planet will experience, because if it's a World War III, it'll be a nuclear war, and it may very well be the last war that any of us ever see. My rationale for saying that is that the state of Israel seems to depend partly or for a majority of its existence on reparations from the West German government. The West German taxpayers, many of whom were not born at the time of World War II, are paying their taxes to prop up the state of Israel. The United States taxpayers are paying $4.5 billion a year to Israel, about $1,500 per Israeli, man, woman, and child. And that money goes to the state of Israel to build up their arms industry and to build up their military so that they will continue oppressing the Palestinian people and engaging in belligerent acts in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, which may very well spark off World War III. Unless we put a stop to that Zionist arrogance, that Zionist imperialism, and that Zionist warmongering, unless we put a stop to it, we might very well see a nuclear war breaking out in the Middle East and dragging everybody else into it. And as I say, the only rationale for this continued support for Israeli expansionism, the only rationale is this so-called Holocaust of 6 million Jews supposedly done to death in Nazi gas chambers. Now, if we can successfully debunk that theory, and I believe we have in this videotape presentation, then we've gone a long way towards delegitimizing Zionist imperialism. Now, of course, besides circulating these videotapes, we also published a wide range of literature. For example, here's a printed version of Holocaust Revisionism for Beginners, and you can obtain copies of flyers such as this from us here at Truth Missions. We also have a wide range of videotapes. You can write to us and ask for our video catalog and also our audio tape catalog. However, there's one thing I should say before I go. If you're considering getting involved in revisionist activism, if you value truth and history, and if you value world peace like I do, don't assume that you can get away with it without bringing an awful lot of trouble onto yourself, because my experience has told me, or has shown me, that a lot of people do not want to hear the truth every time a revisionist asks for a debate, a public debate with an exterminationist. We are refused because they say it's beneath their dignity to debate these issues. It's almost like a religion that they're practicing. These are doctrines which are irrefutable according to them. But worse than that, worse than the silent treatment, is the persecution that can result from engaging in revisionist activity. And there have been several cases around the world of people going to jail and people being put on show trials for daring to contradict Orthodox history. So in part 2 of this video presentation, we're going to interview a man who has experienced that kind of thing himself, and I hope you'll stay with us for part 2 of Holocaust Revisionism for Beginners. Thank you very much for watching this part, and I hope I'll be hearing from you very soon, and I hope you'll be buying our videotapes, our audio tapes, and our literature. So thanks a lot for watching this videotape, and please stay tuned for part 2 coming up in just a few moments.
This is it, right here. It was beautiful. Bradley's bookstore.
Well, here we are down in the heart of Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, not far from Hollywood and Vine. I'm here at, what is it, the 6700 block of Hollywood Boulevard with my friend Bradley Smith, who used to have a bookstore right on this very site. It's called Bradley's Books, which is one of the more unimaginative titles of a bookstore that I can think of. Bradley, back in the 1960s, book censorship and free speech were based on somewhat different issues from they are today. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you in the 1960s right here at your very bookshop?
Well, in the 60s and before, essentially, books were banned in this country for the use of rich sexual language. And so when Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, which had been published in Paris in the late 30s, was finally published here by an American publisher, Grove Press in New York City. Barney Rossa was the publisher. He got them out all over the country, and I bought some. It turns out that I'm not the only bookseller who bought Tropic of Cancer. Every bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard was selling Tropic of Cancer, and I had a big display. I had like 40 copies of Tropic of Cancer put up in this window right here. And one day a friend of mine, I'd been a deputy sheriff, one day in fact I'd broken this guy in the county jail in downtown Los Angeles. He's a newcomer. I came out here, he came in my store one night, and he said, listen, somebody's going to get busted on the boulevard for selling Miller's book. He says, you better get it out of your window and stay a happy bookseller. I thought, it sounds good to me. But I wanted to check him out because he'd married an Eskimo by this time, and I wasn't too sure about it. So I went up and down the boulevard. I looked at all the bookstores, and I noticed that all of the books had already been removed from the bookstore windows. I went up to Pickwick. There was no bookstores in Pickwick. There were no Tropic of Cancers in Pickwick bookstore. While I'm standing there, they sell one from under the counter, to a guy I knew. So I came back down and I thought, well, I better get Tropic out of the window. I climbed in the back of the window to get it out, and I had a half a dozen books in my arm, and I began to feel very bad. I began to feel ashamed.
You began to feel guilty?
Well, shamed. I wasn't guilty because I wasn't committing any crime. I was going to obey the law. So there was no guilt involved, but I felt ashamed. And so I put the books back up. And I thought, I'm going to think about it. Well, the next morning, I took another turn around the boulevard. I came back. I went in the window 3 times to take my books out. 3 times I couldn't do it. A few days later, undercover people with lights came in, arrested me. They asked me who I would sell the book to. The guy who was from Vice. I didn't know he was from Vice, but I could see he was behaving in a very peculiar manner. He's very agitated. I thought, my God, this guy's a sex maniac. And so he said, listen, I want to buy this Tropic book. Will you sell it to me? I said, sure, I'd sell it to you. I'll sell it to anybody. And so he bought it, and then he arrested me. He took me to jail, he booked me, and they tried me. It was the longest civil trial in the history of Los Angeles until that time. 6 weeks. 6 weeks in court. I was convicted. And before I served any jail time, a parallel prosecution went to the state Supreme Court, and the prosecution, the case against the book was overthrown at the state Supreme Court, and I was off the hook.
When these books were seized from your bookshop here, and you were arrested, prosecuted, and put on trial for publishing or distributing forbidden books, what was the actual reaction of your friends in the Hollywood area? I'm sure a lot of them were Jewish, liberal intellectuals. How did they react to your arrest and prosecution?
Well, by and large, they all supported me. Everybody supported me. The people who really gave me some problems were Christians. And the Christian community was largely, not the Christian intellectual community, but the Christian run-of-the-mill community was very much against the use of indecent language in literature. And I had people pick at me. I had people who would express Christian feelings about God and what was right, so would throw garbage in my store. But by and large, all of the intellectual community that I remember now, this happened a long time ago, 25 years ago, they all supported me from every quarter.
Well, Bradley, here we are outside what used to be your bookstore, Bradley's Books. And I noticed somewhat graphically that it's no longer a bookstore, it's now a leather shop and t-shirt shop. So can you tell us something about what happened to your bookstore business after the trial was concluded and after you were let go?
Well, essentially, I went across the street. I opened a bigger bookstore. And I had a large bookstore across the street, and I had a small bookstore here. And I think that I opened it to find a legitimate way to get out of the book business. I got in over my head, and after about 8 or 9 more months across the street, I folded the business because it was taking all of my time, and I was unable to write.
We're here at the Bonaventure Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The Bonaventure Hotel has been the scene of many different revisionist crimes over the years. For example, in 1984, we here at Truth Missions had rented and contracted for a booth and a meeting room here at the hotel in connection with the convention of the California Library Association. Well, now the CLA at that time caved in to threats from the Los Angeles City Council and from the Jewish Defense League and so on, and they cancelled that booth and that meeting. But even before that, there were all kinds of things going on here. For example, in 1979, the Libertarian Party had their convention here that year, and I had just arrived in California about a year before that, and had just founded the IHR, the Institute for Historical Review, and so I came down here with my good friend John Bennett from Australia, who was over here in Los Angeles for the first IHR convention. We came down here to pass out flyers dealing with free speech on revisionism. We came down to pass those out to the libertarian attendees because we felt that those would be a good audience for that kind of free speech approach. Now, as far as we know, we passed out flyers to hundreds and maybe thousands of libertarian attendees. But out of all of those thousands of Libertarian Party attendees, there was only one person who actually responded, and that one person was, again, our good friend Bradley Smith. So let's turn now to Bradley, who happens to be here with us again, back at the scene of the crime, and find out exactly what went through his mind at that time. So Bradley, do you recall the night when you received the revisionist flyer from myself or John Bennett or whomever?
Well, I walked in on a Sunday morning of the Libertarian Presidential Nominating Convention. What I ran into was a little man with white hair and a white beard who was handing out flyers, and these flyers were complaining. Essentially, he began a spiel with me, and his spiel was that libertarians supported a free press. But in this instance, they were refusing to accept books written to challenge the orthodox view of the Holocaust, and that he considered this as the suppression of free exchange of ideas, and he was here to complain to libertarians about the refusal to accept ads for these books, particularly Arthur Butz's The Hoax of the 20th Century. He was handing out flyers, and when I knew what he was talking about, all of a sudden I felt a real sense of shame. The shame wasn't from anything that was inside me holding the flyers, but it was from the awareness that I was being observed by other libertarians, receiving this flyer and looking at it, and in my mind thinking, they may think that I'm interested in this stuff. And so I decided that I would throw the flyer away, and I walked toward a trash can, and as I was walking over there, I happened to notice that the flyer had been translated from French, and it had appeared originally in Le Monde, and which is the internationally famous French daily. And I thought, well, I don't understand what this is. The paper was titled "The Rumor of Auschwitz," or it was called "The Question of Auschwitz: The Rumor of the Gas Chambers." I forget the exact title. And what is this doing, being published in Le Monde? And at the last minute, instead of throwing away, I folded it up, put it in my back pocket, so that on the one hand, I could have the pleasure of reading it, but on the other hand, I had the pleasure of showing all the libertarians who were watching me that I was unwilling to read it in public. And that night, when I got home to my room, where I was alone in Hollywood, I took it out in the dark, as it were, and like a thief in the night, I read these two little essays by Robert Faurisson. The one was by Faurisson and one by John Bennett from Australia. And in 20 minutes, this great dike of belief that had sustained me for 30 years in my belief in the Holocaust story had a crack in it. And I thought it possible, incredibly, that the gas chamber stories were not everything that I had always believed that they were.
Now, after you were first initiated to Holocaust revisionism through this flyer by this mysterious person at the Bonaventure Hotel here at the Libertarian Party Convention, what steps did you take to obtain revisionist books and to actually check out what these wild and crazy claims were?
Well, I didn't do anything for a while. I was certain that I was going to find out something. I felt certain that I was going to find out something, and I was very unsure that I wanted to find it out. And it's amazing that for the next 3 months, when I go back through my notes, I don't have a single note on what was going through my mind from the time I read this article by Faurisson and the one by Bennett, in which it seemed to me that their claims were so simple, they could be checked out so easily, that I felt almost certain there was something to it. 3 months passed until New Year's Eve, 1979. And on the afternoon of New Year's Eve, I called the downtown librarians down there and asked them if they shelved The Hopes of the 20th Century. And to my surprise, they did. So I hopped in the car and I got down there, and it was a very curious experience because, as I say, I was deadly afraid I was going to find out something that I really didn't want to find out, because I felt as if I were going to have some special obligation to it if I found it out. And as I started to climb up the stairs, the front steps of the Los Angeles Public Library, I felt like this weight was on my shoulders, and each step I climbed, the weight got heavier on my shoulders, and it was laughable because I knew what was happening. I knew the psychological mechanism of it, and that as I went up each step, I knew that I was coming closer to accepting the burden of something that I figured could easily destroy what chances I had for a career as a writer. I got in the library, I got the Butts' book, I sat down at the table, and again I don't think I read for more than 45 minutes. And I realized, the first thing I realized was that the idea that 6 million Jews had been killed in World War II was an idea that could never be shown to be true one way or the other because of these giant, brutal population transfers that had taken place. And besides, no one knew what had happened in the Soviet Union at the end of the war. Nobody knew how many Jews were in Eastern Europe at the end of the war, and how many ended up in the Soviet Union after the war. And no one has even tried to find out. It's beyond the pale. The second thing I found out was when Butts was describing the American military authorities torturing German prisoners preparatory to the trials for the Malmedy massacre. And essentially they were torturing them in order to get war crimes information from them. And it occurred to me two things. One is that the evidence that they were being tortured seemed to be on the public record. Two, it seemed I had spent 9 months in Vietnam a few years earlier. Plus I had been in Korea as a rifleman. And it seemed to me that this was something that the Americans were certainly capable of doing. And that if the Americans had done it, God only knows what the Soviets had done in order to get confessions from Germans. And the last reason was that why was it necessary for the Americans to torture Germans to get evidence of war crimes from them if the war crimes had been so self-evident to start with? Thousands, and maybe tens of thousands of Germans have been accused of war crimes. Why was it necessary to torture a handful of additional Germans to get additional war crimes information? By the time I left the library that afternoon, I knew that I was in the revisionist game to one degree or another, and that if I chose to stay out of it, that I'd be betraying something in myself.
Now, Bradley, after you picked up this flyer about the hoax of the 20th century, I presume that you tried to investigate whether the claims in the book were legitimate and were valid. So did you try to check out if there were any book reviews about the hoax of the 20th century published in the New York Review of Books or the LA Times or any place?
Well, originally, of course, I didn't do anything. I didn't look for Butts' book, and I didn't look for any critical reviews of Butts' book. But after I read Butts' book, in fact, the same day, I started to search for critical reviews of his book. I couldn't find any. Over the next couple months, I made various stabs at the library. Finally, at the Santa Monica Library, I had the librarian help me, and we really spent about an hour trying to trace things down. And we couldn't find anything. Literally, Butts' book had not been reviewed. It had not been critiqued by any historians. Butts had not been interviewed from a historical perspective. There was a couple articles in the New York Times about him telling the story about when it was discovered at Northwestern that someone on campus had written a book critical of Holocaust orthodoxy, that demonstrations have been organized by Jewish groups, Hillel particularly. And more than that, there wasn't anything. When I realized that no journalists, no historians, and not a single representative of our intellectual elites had bothered to tell us why we should not read this book, and specifically in what ways it was wrong, then I knew that we had a question in this country of program suppression for free exchange of ideas about the revisionist critique of Holocaust. I later learned that most Western European countries, including Canada, and in all of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, the free exchange of thought on the revisionist is censored by the state. And it's interesting that both the democracies and the Soviet-controlled societies consider this subject significant enough to censor.
When we were up on Hollywood Boulevard outside your former bookshop premises, you talked about the reaction of your liberal intellectual friends to your arrest and prosecution for daring to sell Tropic of Cancer out of your Bradley's bookstore at that time. When you discovered Holocaust revisionism and ventilated this subject with your liberal intellectual friends,
What was their reaction in 1979 compared to their reaction to your pornography charge in 1962?
Well, it's kind of interesting because when I was considered the champion of a free press in Los Angeles for refusing to hide Tropic of Cancer under the counter and to not sell it, the liberal community supported me entirely, and the real negative reactions that I had were by and large reactions from different sorts of Christian denominations and Christian individuals. Now, however, in the 80s, when it turns out that I think that books written by revisionists should have the same access to a free market, and that revisionist ideas should have the same access to a free press that literary ideas had in 2 decades ago, it turns out that Christians are not the people who are most against this. In the Christian community, there are pros and cons with respect to discussing revisionist scholarship. And the people who are really dead set against it are spokespeople for the Jewish community, particularly organized Jewish communities such as the Anti-Defamation League and the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. These people are, by their actions, and usually by their words, do whatever they can, not only to dismiss revisionist thought, but to actually suppress its expression, both on the electronic media and the print press and the universities. And in fact, they have been so assertive in their efforts at this that it's really become a taboo, so that everybody feels uncomfortable when a revisionist critiques any orthodox Holocaust position.
Now, besides the opposition of organized Jewish groups, what kind of reaction did you have from individual Jews who may have been your friends or relatives or whatever?
Well, they essentially have the viewpoint, since none of them know anything about revisionist scholarship. Individual Jews, like individual everybody else, consider revisionist scholarship as anathema and don't accept it, and usually always consider it as to be an expression of anti-Jewish feeling. They never discuss the subject at hand. It's very difficult for them because they don't know anything about it. And two, it's very hard for them to understand why anyone would even want. Their depth of belief is so deep that it's hard for them to understand why anybody would even ask these questions. The Jewish response to a critique of Holocaust orthodoxy today must be like the Christian response to atheist presentation 200 or 300 years ago in France or Germany, in which those who would speak from an atheist position or an agnostic position were just considered crazy. It's unusual in the sense that the Christians were worried that immoral subjective feelings were being expressed in literature that was sexually frank, like the Henry Miller novel, whereas Jews seem to feel that the intellect itself is being betrayed by asking questions about what the Jewish community has been taught to believe totally. We're just as the agnostic 2 or 3 centuries ago was questioning the true belief of the Christians, and now the revisionists are questioning the true belief of the Jewish community. And it has the same kind of witch hunt behind the attempt to suppress it.
right across the street from the Bonaventure Hotel. This building happens to be the downtown headquarters of the Los Angeles Public Library System. And as you may have noticed from the earlier footage, this building suffered a big arson attack about 1 year ago and has been out of business ever since. They are making efforts to reconstruct the building and to restock it with books, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. It should be open by about this time next year. But right now we'd like to talk about a different kind of book burning, the book burning of revisionist books, in particular this book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, which, as you may know, is the most vilified, the most hated book probably throughout American publishing. Now, this book was the one that was featured in the flyer which Bradley Smith was handed at the Libertarian Convention across the street. And this is the book which was actually on the shelves here at the LA Public Library. So let's ask Bradley what exactly happened when he came down here to the library to actually check out this book and how it all felt. So Bradley, what happened when you came down here to get the Hoax of the 20th Century? Did they have it on the shelves? And what did it feel like to take it off the shelf?
Well, at first I didn't do anything at all. In the notes that I have, I waited for 3 months before I ever made the decision to really check up and to see what was going on about this flyer that I'd read. And I think that I was afraid that I was going to find out something that I didn't want to find out. And the day, finally, on the last day of the year, on the afternoon of New Year's Eve, 1979, I called up the library to see if they had the book on the shelf. And surprisingly enough, they did. The lady said, well, she'd put it aside for you. I'd come down and get it. Well, I did. And when I got to the steps on the other side of the library, as I started to go up the steps, I noticed that my body each step I took, my body got heavier. And I realized what was happening psychologically. I felt like I was going to go into the library and read something and discover something that I didn't want to discover. But even though I knew what was happening, it was still happening. And when I went in and got the book, I remember the librarian, when the lady looked up at me from behind the desk, she didn't smile or anything, and I thought, my God, she knows that this is the guy who called her about that Nazi book, and now he's arrived to pick it up. And she has an idea about me that I'll never be able to get out of her mind. And of course she didn't say anything. She gave me the book and I looked at it. And I read the book for about 45 minutes and I discovered 2 or 3 things. One is that the book was very thoroughly referenced, that it was academic in nature, that it recounted material that was just simply too thoroughly referenced to dismiss out of hand, and that it had a couple particularly interesting things. And one was the outline of the way the Americans had treated the Germans in preparation for the Malmedy trial at Dachau, and that the Americans had found it necessary to torture the German soldiers in order to get evidence from them of war crimes. And it seemed to me, since the story was in public domain, it was reported in the press in Chicago and in New York, the story was too easily checked out to be wrong. And the other thing was that why, if the Germans, tens of thousands of Germans have been accused of war crimes, thousands of them are going to be hung for them, and the Americans found it necessary to torture a handful of Germans at Dachau in order to get proof of the war crimes at Malmedy. Something about this really seemed inappropriate to me, seemed real. I thought it was probably true, and I figured that Butts really was into something, the revisionists were into something, and that it was too important to just let it slide.
Well, we're now in Torrance, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. It's a fairly prosperous suburb. Has lots of these little industrial parks all around it, as well as a lot of residential developments. But here in this little industrial park at the south side of Torrance, This is where the Institute for Historical Review first got going. As you may know, the IHR was my idea, but way back in October of 1978. And it was in July or August 1979, we moved in here to these premises at 237th Street in Torrance. And I worked as director of the IHR for the first 2.5 years of its existence. However, I resigned in 1981, and 3 years later, in 1984, on the 4th of July to be precise, these IHR premises were subjected to an arson attack, resulting in damage totaling $400,000 in burned books, burned records, and burned furniture. The books that were burned here included these two, The Hooks of the 20th Century by Dr. Arthur Butts, and this other one, Did 6 Million Really Die, written by Richard Harwood. Now, when almost $500,000 worth of books are burned in one night by an arsonist because the arsonist didn't like the contents, you would have thought that that would have made headline news in newspapers and in the media all across the country. However, after the July 4th, 84 arson attack here at the IHR premises, there was hardly a word in the national media about this Holocaust, and worse still, the police of Torrance made very little effort to apprehend the people who had done it, and in fact, even to this day, in 1987, the arsonists have still not been caught. Now, this failure on the part of the Torrance Police Department and the Torrance city officials to apprehend these modern-day book burners was not by any means unique, because a short time afterwards, I myself suffered the brunt of the bias of the city of Torrance. And in a few moments, we're just going to go over to the City of Torrance Library and the main City Hall, and I'll describe to you exactly what happened to me when I tried to stage an exhibit of books that the people wanted to burn. Right now we're standing in the lobby of the Torrance Public Library, and we're looking at the display cases where they often have exhibits of collections of knickknacks and bits and bobs, mostly put on by local residents or by local community groups. You'll see that this particular display is of tram tickets and train tickets and little souvenirs from the 1920s and 1930s. Now, in 1983, early in 1984, I approached the Torrance Public Library myself and suggested that I could stage an exhibit of banned books in these display cases. Banned books such as The Hooks of the 20th Century, which have been banned in West Germany, and Did 6 Million Really Die, which has been banned in Canada and in South Africa. And in fact, a man was recently sentenced to 15 months in jail in Canada for actually publishing this book in Canada. Now, the case is on appeal, but to actually have a trial in the first place is pretty much. But in any case, I approached the librarian here and asked to stage an exhibit of banned books, and I suggested that it would be a good thing to have it in connection with the American Library Association's Banned Books Week, which they have every year in November. Now, they invited me to come down to the library and show them the books, and they were all, on the telephone, they were all enthusiastic, but when I got here and showed them the books, then they suddenly changed their tune and said, oh no, we can't have those books in our library. We've been warned about those kind of books sneaking into our library. So of course I immediately contacted the ACLU, and they dragged their feet. I contacted the American Library Association in Chicago, and again on the telephone they were helpful and said that they would raise a little hell for the librarian here. But when they found out the nature of the books, then they changed sides and joined the side of the censors. So in any case, in the end, I contacted the California Library Association and contracted for a booth and a meeting room at their 1984 convention in Los Angeles, a booth, a meeting where I could describe what had happened and actually try to get some of the librarians to protest against this outrageous censorship. So we had the contract signed, I had the money paid and everything, and then at the very last minute, the city of Los Angeles put the heat onto the California Library Association and told them that they allowed me to go ahead with my booth and with my meeting, then they would withdraw all support for the CLA. And combined with that,
The Los Angeles Police Department told the CLA that they couldn't ensure their public safety at the convention because there had been threats received from the Jewish Defense League, and the Los Angeles Police Department, with thousands of officers, said they couldn't guarantee the safety of the librarians from a couple of hoodlums at the JDL. So in the end, the CLA cancelled my contract, and I've now had to sue them in the federal court. The case hasn't gone too well so far, but we are planning an appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, and naturally we'll keep you up to date on what happens in developments in that case.